Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, it's just music. I'm SJ, or SJP if you're looking for my playlists on Spotify and you just want to get right to it. It's totally up to you. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it because I know that there's a lot of podcasts about music out there, especially on Spotify. So the fact that you were willing to take the time says a lot about your character and your willingness to explore new things, which is frankly what I've done with this music project. I've done nothing but explore new things because frankly, I knew next to nothing about music when I started this project, and I've learned at least a little bit. I think I've learned something, and we'll hear all about it as we go through this episode, episode 0, before we really dive into the meat and potatoes of this podcast, which will start with 1979, which is episode 1. So what I wanted to do during this episode is to talk a little bit about my history with music, a little bit of history about this project, a little bit about what I've learned so far, and then we'll just close it out and talk about what we do next. So let's talk a little bit about my history with music. So when I was a kid, my family was really interested in music, and they all liked different genres of music. All of them were pretty popular for the time, and I think I also liked music to a certain extent, but I just I don't know. I didn't feel confident in my interest to like it. I found that when I was interested and excited about things, I often found myself embroiled in arguments, discussions, purity tests about what I did or didn't know, what I did or didn't like. And so, my interests got pretty well buried. And to a degree that I actually perceived that it was better to commit to nothing than it was to commit to, any band or genre or album. So for most of my life, I was interested in listening purely to video game music. I got into it, around 1990. And for a really long time, that was all I listened to. When people were recording, on their boom boxes, putting right up to the radio, their favorite songs, I was doing the same thing except right up against my TV when I was, playing a game and trying to record the music so I could listen to it on a cassette tape later. That was my life. And around 2003 to 2007, I decided that I was going to become interested in non-video game music. And it happened because I had been watching a lot of Pop Idol and American Idol and Australian Idol at the time. And so obviously there was a lot of standards and popular music of the time that was getting sung. That captured my interest. Honestly, Dance Dance Revolution and all the music that was remixed in that game also helped to capture my interest about what the original music was. And so I got interested in it. But as I was starting to build this interest in non-video game music, I realized that I had missed so much. I was missing so much context about what music led to these sounds that were popular on the radio at the time, and I just felt lost. And so, the reason that I started this project, people ask me, why did you start this project? And I genuinely, honestly say it's because I had no idea how to engage with music differently than this. I could not think of a simpler, easier way that would satisfy my interest and my curiosity. So I decided I was going to do this project. And what this project was, which I started in 2008, was I was going to listen to every single studio album that I could find of a given year, starting in 1980 and ideally going to current day, that I could find, and just keeping what I liked and getting rid of what I didn't like and just holding on to all this music like some kind of crazy music hoarder. And what I found is, first of all, that I was going to burn myself out, which I did in 2010, where I got from 1980 all the way up until 2003 before I gave up, because there was just too much music to listen to. I was getting exhausted with building the lists of music to listen to. And let's be totally honest with ourselves, I was listening to thousands of songs per year. It was exhausting. Listening to the whole thing, making a judgment call about whether or not I liked it or didn't. And that was even an evolution that I got to later in the first iteration of the project. Early on, I was merely building out mixtapes of my favorite songs from a given year. So I was taking thousands and thousands of songs, of which were, 2 to 3 minutes each on average, right? Because that's about the length of a song. And truncating it down to 70 some odd minutes that fit on a CD. It was an impossible task. I can't believe I actually managed to do 1980 to 1985 before I gave up on that. But after that point, I just decided I was going to keep all the albums that I liked and to stop nitpicking over which songs I liked. So I got all the way to 2003. Then I tapped out. And then as of 2021, I picked it up again, started in 79 this time. And when you actually listen to episode 1 about 1979, you'll find out why I started in 79 versus 80. And then I've gotten today, as of this moment, to 2010, and I aim to get all the way to current time, which at this rate, 2025, 2026 will probably be when I get there officially, depending on how fast and aggressive I can get there and how much work I have to put into doing this podcast every other week. So we'll see, but we're going to go on the journey together. And then after I get to current day, my plan is to start from 1950 and go to 78 and then do a bunch of smaller projects after that. So there's a lot of fertile ground to cover. We're going to have a lot of fun here. So talking about the structure of the project itself, like I said, I was focused on studio albums specifically. So we're not talking about singles. We're not talking about LPs. We're not talking about live albums, which my dad will probably kill me for because he's a big lover of live albums. But I had to create some structure and some rules for myself. They are arbitrary, much like everything in the creative pursuit. So, it is what it is. I'm sure I'm missing a ton. So for this second iteration, whereas I was listening to basically everything under the sun that I could find back in 2008, which earlier internet, it was a little bit harder to find stuff. These days, it's a lot easier, especially with streaming services like Spotify. They did not pay me to say that. What I'm using is allmusic.com, great resource. They are also not paying me, but I use them pretty extensively for almost all Western music, just because that's what AllMusic's expertise is. They have a little bit of Eastern music focus, but not too much. I've had to use other resources like Discogs, another great resource, not paying me, to tap into Japanese and Korean music because I was just interested to follow those journeys too, because I know how popular they are these days in pop culture. And so, it was a side note interest point for me to parallel path, grow my understanding and interest and go on the journey with Japanese popular music and Korean popular music, J-pop, K-pop, and then everything I could find on AllMusic that was rated 4.5 stars or 5 stars. Prior to actually doing this iteration, I was experimenting with how well calibrated AllMusic's ratings were, and they were pretty spot on. Because for 5-star albums, I'm keeping 90% of them. For 4.5 stars, I'm keeping 70% of them. And then for 4 stars, I'm keeping like 10% of them. And then 3 stars all the way down, I'm keeping almost nothing. So good calibration. I do feel bad that I am missing out on that 400 albums that are rated 4 stars. I'm not keeping, like 4 of them, but it is what it is. I would rather not spend my time trashing 396 albums and keeping the 4. But if I genuinely am missing something that was rated 4 stars, which again is total tunnel vision, it's gone beyond my awareness. You send me email, you send me, DMs or whatever on social media or through here, and I will go back and listen and add it to my list accordingly. I am not committed to any of this stuff. There are no rules because it's not scary. It's just music. We're just trying to figure all this stuff out ourselves, right? So that's basically my structure. So there's a couple different things that I've learned so far. One is, and I'm no astrophysicist, right? So let's not pretend like I am, that there is this sort of big bang in creativity where someone will start a new idea and it will inevitably have come from something else, right? There's always a earlier point. Much like the Big Bang, though, there's only so much that I guess science and observability can tell us about what the beginning of something was. So we have hints about what the beginning was, where it was, when it was, who it was, things like that in the case of music. But the thing that I have figured out is that everything came from one idea, one moment, one conversation, one experimentation, one fleeting moment of vulnerability where someone decided that they were going to try something different, even if it was minutely different, and it could have potentially have changed everything and potentially gave birth to movements upon movements upon movements that in turn turned into their own movements, right? So these things proliferate and they have directionality too, right? There is an origination point somewhere at some point in history, and there's a whole trajectory and timeline that these trends and ideas take. And I'll give you a really brief overview of it just as a frame of reference for the rest of the episodes to follow. So what I've found, and this whole process can take place over 30, 35, maybe 40 years. It happens a lot faster than it used to because the internet, has created so many opportunities for experimental ideas to find audiences that, the incubation period to turn it into something a little bit more formalized, a little bit more polished is that window is a lot shorter than it used to be for sure. So let me just give you a really quick rundown. And if you have any questions about it or, want to hear it in greater detail, I could always do a whole episode that just talks about the timeline of a trend line. So just let me give you the rough overview. So there's a new idea. Doesn't matter what the idea is. Let's just call it punk music, right? So it's a new idea. It's never happened before. Somebody somewhere was sitting on a couch thinking about an idea and boom, it happens. They thought, hey, what if we play our instruments totally differently and we sing about things that nobody sang about before? Great. Sounds awesome. What will happen next is it will move into what's called an underground, which we have still a little bit. But like I said, the internet has kind of eradicated most of what the underground is because you could just post new ideas on social media and they just can take flight based upon, the audience and the platform that those posters have. So it'll go into an underground. In the underground, it will shape. It'll take its form. It'll get polished. There will be a couple artists that will separate themselves from the fold. It's not always the artist or the band or whatever that came up with the idea originally. Sometimes, people take it and they run with it. But the underground is usually the place where, there's singles, there's LPs, maybe there's an EP, but for the most part, it's still just a very new idea. It's mostly getting released in live venues or, in this case, social media. One person posting one song, one idea. So that's the underground. Eventually, that underground evolves into an emerging trend. That's when the trend starts to find legs. It's starting to manifest albums across artists. Those key artists that were the key players tend to get a stronger platform. They start distancing themselves and separating themselves from some of the other bands that are still trying to play with these ideas, and they haven't found exactly the way that it hits just yet. And they start to get notoriety. These higher level bands that are rising to prominence. The trends that exist, if there's fashion that goes along with it, if there's art that comes along with it, like it's starting to find its way further into pop culture, into the zeitgeist. There's more and more people that are aware of it. In the underground, there's like diehard dedicated, enthusiasts that are looking for the next big idea, the next big sound. They tend to be those early adopters. In emerging trends, there's more early adopters and also people that, maybe only have like 1 foot in the early adoption side and 1 foot, in current pop culture, on trend culture, versus both feet are just firmly planted in early adoption. So there's more people that are carrying this new idea and these artists into pop culture at this time in emerging trends. And then eventually it becomes on trend. You see it everywhere. Those popular artists are the talk of most music conversations when we're talking about popular music at the time. The fashion, you see it everywhere. The art, you see everywhere. If there's terminology or shared language that's been created as a result of this movement, it's everywhere. You'll find it in the most popular venues. Anywhere where you would find pop culture or pop music that, is considered to be inoffensive and just everybody's listening to it, you'll find that there, like at sporting events and stuff. It's on trend if it's in that space. At this point in time, too, this is when kind of those artists at the top just get put into the pantheon of being the best of the best. In those moments, they are considered the tippy top best examples of that movement, and they, to their own credit, are idolized in that community that are the greatest enthusiasts for for that movement. So when it's on trend, though the highest heights, you're at the highest heights, you're at the peak of the mountain for sure. But what comes up must come down. And so eventually you start to move out of trend. And then over time you move further out of trend. Those popular artists start to become a little less popular. Inevitably, there's probably a new idea that's starting to overtake the existing idea, and so it's starting to move that earlier idea out of favor, out of trend. The fashion, the art, all that stuff starts to move away a little bit. And then eventually it moves into being passe, which is nobody really wants to talk about it anymore. Everybody's a little bit embarrassed if they're still, really excited about that thing because they feel like they're getting left behind in favor of whatever the new idea or the new trend is. So there's a certain degree of social pressure that comes along with trying to encourage people that are hangers on to a certain movement to move out of it once it's considered to be passe. And you can really tell when something is passe because not only are the total volume of artists that are trying to do that sound greatly diminished, but also there's like one band that might be doing one thing that's good and everything else just sounds like an old sound at that point. Like nobody's really interested anymore. Once you go towards passe, eventually they dig a hole, toss that idea in there, and bury it deep. But it's not like a body. It's not like we're burying a casket. Because again, it's not scary. It's just music, right? It's more like a seed. And that seed has to germinate, and its roots have to grow for a really, really, really long time. We're talking 15, 17 years, maybe 20 years, where it'll sit in the ground and incubate for a very long time. During the burial period, nobody's talking about this trend. They might say, like, remember way back when, oh yeah, I can't believe we were doing that. I can't believe we were listening to that. That was so ridiculous. What a silly moment in time we were finding ourselves in. Like, nobody wants to acknowledge that they were part of that moment. And if you do, then everybody just kind of looks at you and says, what's wrong with you? Why were you so committed to this thing? It's so over, right? And then eventually they move into this incubation period. And this incubation period is basically people starting to, let's just say, entertain the trend again a little bit more as like, hey, I remember that song. Remember when that song played? Yeah, my parents used to listen to that or whatever. Because again, it's probably like 20-ish years between when something has been buried and people start, going back and revisiting it a little bit. It's starting to be like, yeah, I remember when I was a kid, I was listening to that music. My parents were listening to it. It was on the radio when I was a kid, things like that. So people gently start to revisit it. Also, records or CDs, cassette tapes, even these days streaming music, like people start to revisit this old stuff and say, wow, that's super interesting. I can't believe that they were playing with these ideas back then. So they start to kind of entertain giving this trend another look-see because what they were singing about back then still resonates today, or some of those conventions sound a little bit, more interesting compared to, what's going on today, or at least it's a total juxtaposition. Because usually what happens in this case is you move into an underground revival, which is that much like the original underground, that underground starts to revive itself in the form of a counterculture that is pursuing taking that trend and turning it into something retro. So the underground revival will be, again, kind of one or two artists that have rediscovered this idea, much like originally discovering the idea the first time, and saying, hey, I wonder what would happen if we played with this idea a little bit. And in this underground revival, that's when you start to get kind of two different personas of artists, at least in music. One is artists that try to do everything they can to sound exactly like what their modern interpretation of that idea is now. And usually that idea is highly essentialized. So a good example of that is in the 2000s when everybody was obsessed with the 80s as a retro idea. It wasn't actually the 80s. It was an essentialized version of it where everybody assumed that everybody was just listening to synth music and wearing neon, spandex clothes and was, wearing headbands and side ponytails and perms and all sorts of ridiculous stuff, right? In no way was that actually what was happening day to day. But when it comes to a retro trend, everybody's taking those essentialized pieces of pop culture, presuming that was the standard in some sort of like fantastical mythology, and that becomes what the revival and the counterculture is. So that's during the counterculture evolution, where they're taking that fantasy and starting to mobilize it into this new retro idea that starts with either completely copying this essentialized version or taking those ideas and merging them with modern conventions to create something new. So, two different paths, both of them happen every single time. As far as I've listened thus far, it's happened many, many times already. It happened in the 80s, it happened in the 90s, the 2000s, and I'm sure it's going to happen in the 2010s, right? Like even in 2024, everybody's saying how obsessed they are with 90s, things, even though it's been, 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years that people have been playing with this 90s retro idea. Trust me, in just a few years, we're going to start pretending like everything that happened in the 2000s was a brand new thing. And we're going to essentialize down some aspect of what was happening in the 2000s. And it's going to become the retro movement. Just give it time. I guarantee you it's going to happen 100%. It is going to happen. You can quote me on it. It will happen. And it'll happen in 2040, about the 2010, like it'll happen. And what I'll say is that the time between the movement being on trend and becoming a retro on trend movement is about 25 years. 20 to 25 years. Like 18 years is probably when bands are starting to go through that incubation period, or revisiting, or starting to build out that underground revival and counterculture. That's like 17, 18 years since it's been on trend. 16 years, 15 years, it's still a little bit too much like it's an old sound, we don't want to touch it. 16, 17 years is a little aggressive, but people start to get interested in it. By the time you hit 20 years, 20, 22, 23, 24 years, you're right on trend for whatever that retro thing is. And then once we get to 26, 27, 28 years, again, it kind of moves out, it becomes passé, and we bury it again. But unlike what happened last time where you bury it and then it kind of has this revival thing, what actually happens this time is that it goes into what I call the historical archive, which is everybody acknowledges the value that it had at that moment in time, and people sort of respect it for what it was, because during that retro experience, you will have these two different populations of people that are experiencing it in this essentialized fantasy that are younger and didn't experience it firsthand, and the people that experienced it firsthand, and the sort of mismatch of experiences that they have, where you'll have older people saying, yeah, I get that you're wearing all these baggy pants and this and that and, crop tops and everything for the 90s, but this is actually what it was like. It wasn't like this thing. Or, man, remember when this happened? So, like, the retro underground counterculture movement eventually becomes better educated about that moment in time, and it demystifies it a little bit. And so that actually helps to exercise the retro movement into moving towards a historical archive, which is everybody really understands what was happening at the time. Everybody understands what people were thinking at the time. There's a more clear-eyed sense of what that idea was in the moment and what it turned into later. And once there's that general acceptance, we move into the last stage, which is historical immortality. It exists forever. It will exist forever. There's no question about what it is. It likely won't influence another trend in the future. It'll just sort of be accepted for what it is. A good example is Bing Crosby or Frank Sinatra or the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, right? Like everybody understands what this is, and the likelihood that they will somehow evoke a new trend is far diminished. Like the likelihood is super small. It's not impossible, but it's really diminished. We just sort of appreciate it now for what it is. Now, the only things that I can't necessarily speak to in this case are things that have up and down curves that aren't necessarily boom and bust like most popular culture trends, but things like ska, for example, that have had many, many, many waves over the course of its history. That's different. It in the 90s, it did kind of hit this peak because it kind of emerged back into popular culture. I would say that there was a long kind of trend line that it took in order to get to that moment. Like it had to work really hard in order in like 1992 for that wave of ska to hit the popularity that it did. But then it's kind of gone back underground, and it pops up every once in a while to a minimal extent. But it's never more than likely going to hit that huge height that it once did. Because in and of itself, it is a retro sound. It's an old idea, and I think everybody kind of acknowledges that it's an old idea. And so because of that, the likelihood that we're ever going to go back there genuinely, as opposed to just sort of reveling in that retro moment, exactly as it was back then and those traditions, it's probably not going to happen. And then similarly, jazz. Jazz is on its own time scale life, because jazz is totally free and open. You could do whatever you want in jazz. The interpretation and definition of jazz is pretty wide open. So jazz is, first of all, something that I haven't explored meaningfully in this project, just because it's on its own timeline, it's on its own time scale. It doesn't correlate at all with anything else that's happening because it's just got its own rules. So I didn't pursue it. But jazz is another really good example of just it's on its own schedule. It doesn't follow this timeline. It does whatever it wants. Okay. The last thing I'm going to say about this project is that, having said what I just said about jazz, I do tend to give almost everything a chance when I'm listening to it. I do have my own biases towards certain genres, towards certain bands, against certain genres, against certain bands. But that's not to say that I won't give everything a chance. Like, there are certain genres where high-rated music comes up year after year after year, and I'll give it a listen. I'll listen through it and I'll just go, you know what? It's just not for me. It's not resonating. It's been done so many different times, so many different ways. It's just not connecting with me. And I'll leave it by the wayside. So you will probably, as you go through these years, looking at my playlist, listening through, hearing what I have to say, saying, SJ is missing a lot of stuff here. He's missing this genre, he's missing that genre, he's missing that album, this album, and but I, much like every other listener, come with my biases, not necessarily defending it, but just kind of giving a sense that you will see that there are some continued gaps and some common gaps. But having said that, I am always happy to debate my biases. Again, it's not scary. It's just music. You just listen to this stuff and you create an opinion, a perspective about it. And because of that, I've learned to just be kind of open to everything. I would say that that's been one of the most meaningful things that's happened to me so far, which I'm going to challenge everybody that's listening to this podcast as we go through these years to do too, is challenge yourself. I am going to help as we're going through each year and talk through what I consider to be the challenge or the complexity of every album from a scale of, 1 to 10. 1 being super, super easy to listen to. You can put it on in the background, basically ignore it, and it's all good. 10 I can't even imagine a 10 because you would have to pay such close attention to what's happening. And it could necessarily be, annihilating and assaulting your ears while it's happening, even if it's great. And it might just be really challenging to listen to. But the thing about listening to music is that every person has some range of comfortability with certain genres of music. And the only way to really grow that range of comfortability, to iron out that stiff peak that you have of I can only really listen to this kind of music and be okay with it, is you listen to a bunch more different kinds of music and a bunch of different genres and get exposed to different interpretations of what people consider to be music, and you do find that comfort. So I'm going to challenge you all listeners to listen to potentially some challenging music. Nothing that I can't imagine a universe where I'm giving you something that's a 9 or a 10, where it's almost unlistenable to even the most seasoned of music listeners, but it's really great, right? Because to me, it's like spicy food. Could you eat a raw, scorpion pepper or ghost reaper pepper just to prove to yourself that you can do it, even though you're going to vomit immediately afterward? Yeah, sure. That sounds awesome. I love that for you. Not me though. When it comes to spicy food, because I'm a big buffalo wings guy, there's got to be a balance between spiciness and flavor. The spiciness has to have some kind of purpose to add to the flavor, or else it's just like a human versus food thing, and that's not interesting to me. I don't have anything to prove to myself. You don't have anything to prove to yourself or your friends, your cool friends, your not cool friends, whatever it is. And so it's really just about you experimenting and becoming vulnerable with different interpretations of music that maybe you haven't been exposed to before, or you are a seasoned listener and everything that I'm telling you is obvious stuff. And, maybe we come off our high horse a little bit and say, you know what, I haven't listened to this album for a while. I'm going to revisit it because there's this new idea. Or maybe I didn't see that there was this connection between this thing, this idea and that idea, several years down the line. So let's all just kind of enjoy it together. But having said that, I'm doing this podcast because I want to connect all of you to this journey. I want to share this music with more people than just myself. I want to generate meaningful discussion and debate. If you hate all the albums that I'm recommending, that's awesome. That's really great. I want to hear about it. If you love them all, that's also really great. I'm so excited. If you're learning stuff, that's great. If you've learned absolutely nothing and you knew all of this stuff already, that's awesome. I'm so happy for you. But, on the whole, I'm doing this podcast because maybe all of us can get something out of it more so than what I've been doing by myself, digging up all this music and listening to it and putting them into these gigantic, playlists on Spotify. Again, they didn't pay me. And just enjoying it together. So having said that, I'm going to close out a little bit here and talk about what you can expect from this podcast. So every other week, I'm going to do each year. So start with 79 and then 80, 81, 82, 83, etc. And I'm going to have an essentials playlist for that year that comprises all the albums that I'm recommending on the episode. And then I have a bigger playlist that is just kind of everything that I kept from that year when I was going through the project originally. So I'll have both. I'll have all of these are really great, meaningful, important albums. And then here's the essential list. Me as a person, I don't know. I feel like we've been talking to each other for a while at this point. It's been several minutes. I think you kind of understand who I am as a person. I'm fairly passionate. I'm excited about this music. I'm excited to talk about it. I'm excited to talk to you all about it. If you want to, send me your thoughts. I'm very excited about all of this because you just never know where any of this is going to take you, which is kind of half the fun of this project. I have no idea what's coming next with some of this music. I'll think that music is going in one direction in 2009, and then in 2010, I get shocked by some of the stuff that people are coming up with. It's fantastic. It's what makes this whole thing so magical. So give me everything. Give me your thoughts. Give me your hate. Give me your love. Give me everything. Give me your banality. I don't really care. It's going to be great no matter what it is. Because your opinion matters. Your perspective matters. Mine also matters. But, I think they all kind of matter in different ways. So what happens now? I'm going to make 1979. We're going to put it out there. You're going to listen to it, hopefully. Totally up to you. I would encourage you to join us again. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, you can hit me up in the multitude of different ways that you can do that, either via email, posting comments, connecting with me via social media, whatever you want. If you have opinions about what I should be putting together on my essential list, I'm happy to take that feedback because feedback is a gift. But at the end of the day, let's be completely honest with ourselves. None of this stuff is scary. None of this stuff is daunting. None of this stuff is challenging. It's really, honestly, just music. Let's all enjoy it together. Thanks, everybody.